Hello, brothers. It's the we're back with The Devil and the Jews by Joshua Trachtenberg, the medieval conception of the Jew and its relation to modern anti-Semitism. A lot of people are commenting on these videos that there's a reason that the Jews are hated, but this book was written for the Anti-Defamation League by the um, Jewish Publication Society of America. So this is not an anti-Jewish book. It's a book discussing anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. Chapter 6, Magic and Medicine. Such specific charges of magical activity as we have been reviewing, rare as they were, seem to have been wholly incidental, and probably derived from the general conception of the Jew far more than they influenced it. The essential feature of the Christian fear of Jewish sorcery, it must be emphasized, is that it adhered not to certain individual Jews who had aroused it by their actions, but rather to the entire people. That it was so poorly supported by the facts, as we have noticed, in no way diminished the tenacity with which it persisted. The Jew was, by definition, a sorcerer, and all his works were suspect. The Hebrew sources of the period offer striking testimony to supplement the wealth of evidence from non-Jewish sources. In their ignorance of the Jewish religion, people were quick to perceive a diabolical scheme for working magic against Christians in actually inoffensive ritual acts, which by their strangeness laid themselves open to suspicion. The custom of throwing a clod of earth behind one after a funeral, a practice, incidentally, borrowed from Christian usage, brought a charge of sorcery, with intent to cast a magic spell over the Gentiles, to kill them. In Paris in the early years of the 13th century, which might have been serious consequences if a certain Rabbi Moses ben Yehiel had not succeeded in persuading the king of its utterly harmless character. The practice of washing the hands on returning from the cemetery aroused the same suspicion of sorcery and provoked some bloody scenes. So onerous did these recurrent accusations become that the rabbis of the Middle Ages found it necessary, under the pressure, no doubt, of an apprehensive Jewish public opinion, to suspend some of these customs, or at least to counsel caution in their observance. Since Gentiles are to be found among us, and there are Gentile servants in our homes, we must be on guard lest they say it is magic, warned a 13th century writer in terms so often repeated by others as to indicate that such misinterpretation was far from uncommon. In the case of the clod throwing, though many were obliged to disregard the usage for fear that the Gentiles would accuse them of sorcery, custom was proof against fear, and the rabbinic authorities refused to sanction its abrogation. But in other instances, fear triumphed. The mourning rites of binding the head and overturning the bed lapsed during the Middle Ages for this reason. In Talmudic times, fear of the same accusation had led Jewish authorities to excuse the head of the household from the rite of searching out the leaven on the eve of the Passover in places owned in common with a non-Jew. During the Middle Ages, there was a strong but unsuccessful agitation to suspend this rite altogether, even indoors, because we have Gentile serving girls in our homes who might spread the alarm. In Provence, however, the ritual cleansing of the public oven in preparation for Passover baking was widely neglected because of the Gentiles' suspicion of sorcery. We read also of a lamb slaughtered in fulfillment of a ritual obligation, which was cut up and buried secretly in sections, so that the matter may not become known, and they say it was done for magical ends. To such measures were Jews driven by fear of arousing the suspicions of their neighbors. When a fire broke out in a Jewish house, its owner dared expect no sympathy, and indeed little mercy from the mob, for he was a sorcerer seeking to destroy Christendom, and his punishment was commonly simultaneous with his crime. Fire swept rapidly through the tinderbox towns of those days, and the populace was justifiedly in dread of a conflagration. But the responsibility was so consistently laid upon the Jews, entire communities were time after time ravaged and expelled, even when the fire did not first break out in the Jewish quarter, that we cannot ascribe the circumstances solely to the cupidity or passion of the mob. If it was, as was often the case, it was asserted that the guilty arsonists were witches in league with the devil, then the Jews could not escape the taint of complicity. Supported as this suspicion was by their purported intention to destroy Christendom's Christendom by whatever means, the rabbis of the time were therefore unusually tolerant about violations of the prohibition to extinguish fires on the Sabbath and the Day of Atonement. For this is a matter of life and death, since they accuse us and persecute us. The ease with which crimes of arson could be pinned on the Jews is excellently illustrated by an incident that occurred in Deggendorf, Bavaria, in 1337. As the result of a charge of host desecration, the Jewish quarter was attacked and set on fire. In no time at all, the whole town was ablaze. But when some time later a church was erected to commemorate the event and a suitable inscription was placed at its entrance, this was how it read: Anno 1337, the day following Michaelmas Day, here were the Jews slain. They had set the city afire. It need occasion no surprise, then, if the Jews, as Schutt maintains, tried to perfect a magical technique to extinguish fires. His painstaking effort to tear down their repute as magic firefighters indicates that it was fairly well entrenched, though it could not have been any more welcome than their fame as fire makers. What do you got, bruv? It was a perverse fate that exacted a penalty for both, as Rabbi Naphtali ben Isaac had ample occasion to reflect in his Frankfurt prison cell. It was generally believed in that city that he possessed a magic formula against fire. But, as luck would have it, a fire broke out in his own house and destroyed a considerable section of the Jewish quarter. He went to jail for having started the fire with his magic experiments to prevent fires. Hello, brobs. Jews were stoned as sorcerers, but it needs little knowledge of human nature to believe that the very vice, not nice, became a virtue when Christians themselves had need of a little expert magic on the side. If Jews were magicians, their every act a charm, then their magic devices could aid as well as harm. We have already seen how the masses turned to Jews to bless their crops or to pray for rain, despite the displeasure of the clergy. Rabbi Isaac ben Moses of Vienna in the 13th century reports that once he was in Regensburg, over a holiday, a Gentile who had much power in the city fell dangerously ill, and ordered a Jew to let him have some of his wine, or he would surely die. And I gave this Jew permission to send him the wine in order to prevent trouble, though there were some who disagreed and forbade this. Apparently, Jewish wine possessed occult healing powers. Perhaps this Gentile had in mind wine that had been blessed by Jews. It would be interesting to know how effective the cure was. But Rabbi Isaac carries his anecdote no further. Hello, bros. The mezuzah, a biblical inscription attached to the doorpost, was also an object of suspicion, and at the same time of desire. The Jews of the Rhineland had to cover over their mezuzot For, as a 13th century author complained, the Christians, out of malice and to annoy us, stick knives into the mezuzah openings and cut up the parchment. Out of malice, no doubt, but the magical repute of the mezuzah, I'll call it mezuzah, it sounds more like bazuzu. Mezuzah must have lent special force to their vindictiveness. That it was regarded as a magical device by Christians, we know, for a 15th century writer admonished his readers to affix a mezuzah to their doors even when they occupied a house owned by a non Jew, despite the danger that their landlord might accuse them of sorcery. Even Gentiles in high places were not averse to using these magical instruments themselves. Toward the end of the 14th century, the Archbishop of Salzburg asked the Jew to give him a mezuzah to attach to the gate of his castle. But the rabbinic authority to whom this Jew turned for advice refused to countenance such use of a distinctively religious symbol. In the field of medicine in particular, the reputed Jewish magical skill was called upon to perform miracles. According to the popular view, demons and sorcery were often responsible for disease, and medicine was therefore the legitimate province of the sorcerer, or to put it the other way around, a supply of charms and amulets was a legitimate part of the physician's pharmacopoeia. Through superstition without end, one seeks today his health to mend. Did I it all together fit? A heresy book I'd make of it, wrote Sebastian Brandt, with the excellent reason with excellent reason. Jacques de Vitry tells a characteristic story. When the Pope falls ill, Satan appears in Specium Medici and offers to cure him. But the Pope rebuffs the devil doctor with the affirmation that he trusts less in drugs than in the prayers of pious widows. The medicine man has only just yesterday evolved into the man of medicine. The tradition of Jewish medical proficiency was so deeply rooted in the Middle Ages that the Sachsenspiegel, one of the great German codes, granted the Jews the privileges of the king's peace on the ground that it was Josephus who gained this peace for them from King Vespasian when he cured his son Titus of the gout. This legend was quite widespread and recurs in a number of German law books as the explanation of the favor and protection extended to the Jews by the German rulers, who considered themselves the successors of the Roman emperors and therefore bound by the obligations they had supposedly assumed. There was a fairly substantial basis for the tradition. Jewish physicians, though by no means altogether free from the general superstitious attitude, were among the foremost representatives of a scientific medicine in medieval Europe. Their wide knowledge of languages, the availability of Arabic, Greek medical texts in Hebrew translation, their propensity for travel and study abroad, their freedom from the church fostered belief in miraculous cures, relics, and the like, and perhaps not least the tradition that associated the practice of medicine with the best minds and the highest scholarship, often conspired to make them more effective practitioners than their non Jewish competitors. Paradoxically, their scientific training, such as it was, made them also superior magicians in the popular view, and every triumph of medical science enhanced the Jew's reputation for sorcery. His putative sorcery probably made a deeper impression than his scientific skill. It is no surprise to learn that his proficiency depended upon his ability to interpret dreams, or that he practiced mainly with the aid of characters in occult names and similar charms. When someone at his table pointed to the acknowledged ability of Jewish physicians, Luther put him off with the rejoinder, "The devil can do much." This accounts for the undoubted popularity of Jewish doctors in Europe throughout this period, despite stringent church prohibitions constantly reiterated by popes and synods. And the caveat of the clergy that these Jews would turn their magic against their patients. In the effort to keep Christians away from Jewish physicians, calumnious tales were widely circulated. Gregory of Tours reported, for instance, that after Leonas, Archdeacon of Bourges, had been miraculously healed, he turned to a Jewish doctor for further treatment, and his ailment immediately returned. He would have remained healed, said Gregory, had he not, after God's miraculous cure, turned to the Jews. Note how the plural implicates all Jews as accessories to the act. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, the campaign against Jewish physicians, spurred by motives of economic competition as well as of superstition and piety, attained a high pitch of virulence. No slander was too mean to be turned to account. Not only were they black satanic sorcerers, godless, accursed, Christian-hating Jews, but they knew nothing of medicine anyway, and often caused the death of their patients through ignorance or through malice, for their primary aim was to injure Christians. When they come together at their festivals, each boasts of the number of Christians he has killed with his medicine, and the one who has killed the most is honored, runs Johann X, variation upon an inexhaustible theme. The notorious Jewish sorcerer physician found a part on the stage too. Hans Sachs, I'm not sure how you say it. Sachs, I'll say Sachs. Hans Sachs serves him up as a burlesque fortune teller, who, when he can't make a go of that, sets up shop as a physician, though he knows nothing of either profession. Unabashed, the charlatan declaims, I have studied neither black magic nor medicine. I know nothing about healing matters, except to make a vile purgation guaranteed to rack the peasant with bellyache. It helps one, the other dies of it, but that makes no difference to me. The attitude found more frequent and more violent expression in the north of Europe than in the south, where a greater tolerance and a higher degree of scientific learning prevailed, but it was by no means lacking in the south too. A tale of Franco Sacchetti, the friend of Boccaccio, about two women who are swindled by a Jew who sells them a drug to help them conceive, winds up with the fretful exclamation, it is remarkable that Christians, men and women, will put more trust in one Jew than in 100 Christians, yet will repose no trust at all in a single Christian. And after another similar story, he complains again, it is something new to seek healing in Jewish machinations. It happens quite often nowadays that one trusts a single Jew more than 1,000 Christians. Nonetheless, for all the hysterics of the Jew baiters, which were not without their effect upon the masses, Jewish doctors continued in demand. In 1652, the clergy of Frankfurt complained to the city council about their unabated popularity and remarked, sooner sick at God's will than healed through the devil and through forbidden means, i.e., magic. To employ Jewish doctors means nothing else than to cuddle serpents in our bosom and to raise wolves in our home. When a Jewish physician was granted permission to practice in the city of Hall in Swabia in 1657, the clergy epitomized the clerical position as it prevailed throughout the Middle Ages in a succinct public statement. It is better to die with Christ than to be healed by a Jew doctor with Satan. Jesus Christ. But who would risk his life in the hands of an inferior Christian physician for the sake of theological scruple when a powerful Jewish doctor magician could be called in? The popularity of these same Jew doctors permits us to surmise that this pious preference was reserved for whole moments when the issue was joined. When the issue was joined, the ministrations of Satan were not rejected. Or was there something to the story two women told of being bewitched by a Jewish doctor so that they could use no other? A good share of responsibility for the continued dependence upon Jewish medical skill, despite the popular agitation, and the increasing obstacles erected by clerical and secular legislation must be laid to the example set by the nobility and hierarchy. Princes and even ecclesiastics, right up to the Pope, held themselves above the restriction. Thus they imposed upon the masses. The Hebrew account of the statutes of Valladolid, adopted in 1412, reads significantly, "It was decreed that there should not be among them, the Jews, a physician except a physician to the king." The last phrase, which does not occur in the original decree, points to the frequency with which the nobility disregarded the prohibition. Indeed, Pope Martin V, in a bull, is that a bull or a bill? It says bull, issued September 1421, granted the Spanish royalty the express privilege of employing Jewish physicians. Even the brother of Louis IX, Alphonse of Poitiers, the most rabidly anti-Jewish prince of the time, pleaded for the aid of a Jewish physician to save him from blindness. Jews were forbidden to reside in England after 1290, but in 1310, Edward II granted a Jewish physician the right to enter the country. And a century later, we find Henry IV summoning two Jewish physicians from Italy, Elia di Sabato and David di Nigarelli of Lucca, and a third, Samson of Mirabeau, from France, to treat him and giving them permission for an extended stay. Indeed, everywhere in Europe, physicians were often exempted from the restrictions and disabilities imposed upon the rest of the Jewish populace. For those who are interested, there are lists of Jewish physicians practicing during the Middle Ages. We know of many of them only because their names have been preserved in Christian documents, recording their services to Christian rulers and prelates, their receipt or loss of privileges, or the occasional tragic rewards of their efforts. For if the patient risked his life when he called in a Jewish doctor, the doctor risked his too when he rolled up his sleeves and set to work. If his ministrations were successful, he was likely to be considered a magician and could expect to be treated as such, with fear and respect and active curiosity. If he failed, he was all the more a sorcerer and deserved nothing better than to pay promptly for his crime. And that's the end of chapter 6. The Devil and the Jews, the medieval conception of the Jew and its relation to modern anti-Semitism by Joshua Trachtenberg.